slow down. I'm always burning my tires and my horn is too loud. I catch people staring, looking funny at me when I step to the window and I toss a TV. Sometimes I get crazy and it makes a big scene, but when I hit 21, I want to stand up and scream. I'm filthy rich with laughter, I'm too big for the room. You know, from 2 stories up, a zenith makes a big boom. It's hard to get around in a 6-foot town when you're 10 feet tall. Everything is so small. I'm always bumping my head. I'm way too long for the bed. Yeah, it's hard to get around in a 6-foot town. Some people live inside a tiny little box. They're preoccupied about mismatching their socks. Well, I've never been one to worry about much. I just want to laugh and love. I just want to live it up. But it's hard to get around in a 6-foot town. When
Welcome in, everybody.
you're 10 feet tall,
Great to be with you
everything's so
on this
small.
Tuesday morning. It is election day, and I do apologize for my absence yesterday. I was a little under the weather. Think I'm okay now. Think that everything will be all right. So I am glad to be with you on this election day. Lots and lots to talk about, as you can imagine. It is my election day extravaganza, and we always focus on the issues. We want to be just laser focused on the election today, and that's exactly what we're going to do because of that. With that in mind, we are going to be going down race by race, issue by issue, everything on the ballot this morning. And I want to preface it with a couple of things. First of all, I don't tell anybody how to vote because that's up to you. That's your job. My job is to give you information. My job is to arm you with arguments to help you understand some of the nuances and help really digest the news stories of the day and the policy prescriptions that each of the candidates bring to the table. But it is not my job to make those decisions for you. I just try to give you the information and let you make those decisions on your own. That is solely up to you. And so, with that in mind, that's really how I see my job. That's really how I see what I'm supposed to be doing. And so, I'll give you some ideas on the vote, and I will tell you who I'm voting for. But as far as who you vote for, that's up to you. That's your decision. Because I'm a fallible human being. I make mistakes. Sometimes I vote the wrong way. I look back and I have regretted some of the votes that I've cast, but nonetheless, I do want to give you as much information that we have available to me now. And if you want to tell me how you're going to vote, you agree with my picks, you disagree with my picks, whatever it is, just call us at 860-1440. We will be glad to take your calls, especially on Election Day. I love hearing from people on Election Day, whether they're going to vote, what candidate they like. And so I did want to real quickly address one thing before, because there's been a lot of buzz around in the political sphere, a lot of buzz when it comes to news about Donald Trump and this being a referendum on him. And if you were listening to the show Decisions with Kevin Elkins from 7 to 9 on News Radio 1440, you heard that there were quite a few callers that even though we were talking about an election in which Trump is not actually on the ballot, everything revolves around Trump. Absolutely everything revolves around Trump. I don't like it. I've complained about it. No telling how many times. If you've been a fan of mine for a while, you know that. But we are living in a Trump-centric universe. And part of the reason that I've said, even though Trump had an ego long before he was president, let's not kid ourselves. One of the reasons that I have said for quite some time that Donald Trump is an egomaniac is look at how people react to the things that he says. I mean, this guy just tweets something while he's on the can at 6 a.m., and that sets the course for the entire news day for the rest of the day. And unfortunately, we are living in a society where Trump is the center of everything in politics. And to a great degree, I think to a lesser extent, but to a great degree, you saw a very similar phenomenon happening with Obama, which to me is a huge indication that the president is far too powerful. No president, regardless of who he is, whether it's Obama or Trump or Bill Clinton or Ronald Reagan or whoever else you want to throw in there, no president should affect your daily life enough to where you are, as several Democrats have talked about this week, like Barbara Streisand, you're losing sleep over it. You can't eat. Food tastes different. You can't think straight. No president should affect anybody's life that much. Nobody. I could maybe see it causing you a great deal of frustration if you're in his cabinet or you're somebody that works directly under the president, like if you're, for example, on the FBI, something like that. But especially when we're talking about the average citizen, I don't even think it should affect them that much. But especially when you're talking about the average citizen, the president should not be able to affect their private life that much. And I'm not saying that the president should just agree on everything and one president should be exactly like the president before. No, that's not what I'm suggesting at all. Elections should have consequences and we should have stark decisions to be made between one candidate that believes one thing and another candidate that believes something else, and our vote should have an effect on how the president does decide things and whether or not he uses veto or his other presidential powers. I'm not suggesting that we should have homogenous candidates. What I am saying, though, is no president should have the authority and doesn't have the authority under the original Article 2 of the Constitution to affect the individual person's life that drastically. And to me, the fact that it does is an indication that our federal government as a whole and the executive power specifically has grown way too much in the past several decades. And so what's very frustrating to a lot of people, myself included, is that you can't even have a conversation about an election in which Trump is not even on the ballot without falling into the wormhole that is Donald Trump. Because when you start talking about people, inevitably, and this happened a number of times on the radio this morning, we had callers call in and say, well, I voted for Democrats this time because I don't like Trump. That doesn't make any sense. You can vote for Democrats because you like what they believe. You can vote for Democrats because you think their policy prescriptions are good or will be helpful or whatever. But you shouldn't vote for somebody because you don't like another guy in a different party who's not even running. You really shouldn't even vote, I contend. You really shouldn't even vote for the lesser of two evils and vote for somebody because you think the other guy's a bad guy. I'm not even of that persuasion, but it certainly makes no sense to vote one way because you don't like another person that is not running for that race in the party, even if he is the leader of the party, which right now, because he's the president, Trump undoubtedly is. And so it just makes absolutely no sense for you to cast your vote against someone who's not even in the race. Judge people as individuals, not collectives, not masses. And for the Democrats who, by and large, maybe not exclusively, but by and large, tend to see people as groups and not individuals, you are essentially a collection of labels. You are not a person with your own beliefs and your own ideas. This is an idea that makes sense to them, that you vote for party, you don't vote for person. You don't vote for individuals. But this is unfortunately an issue that we see all too often. And here's really the bottom line on this. You should have to earn my vote on your own merits. Not somebody else, not loyalty to a specific person. You, the candidate, have to convince me that you will vote and use the power that is granted to you in a certain way that it would be in line with my values and my beliefs. You can't just be not the other guy. Your campaign slogan should not be, well, that guy's really terrible, so vote for me. No, you should have to earn my vote. And if neither candidate earns my vote, I'm not going to vote for either candidate. I'll do a write-in, I'll abstain, whatever, but I'm not voting for you unless you actually earned my vote. I get that there's other people that don't necessarily subscribe to that philosophy, but that's what I believe. And so you understand that right out of the bat. And to a great degree, there are a lot of candidates, unfortunately, that have intentionally, specifically done this to themselves. And one of the things I'm thinking about, even though I'm hoping that DeSantis pulls off a victory, even though it really doesn't affect me that much because I live in Alabama, so Florida's governor race is just not a big deal to me. But when you're talking about somebody like Ron DeSantis going up against Andrew Gillum, I think that it is incredibly stupid to hitch your wagon that closely to somebody, because you remember that dumb ad that came out a few months ago where Ron DeSantis was teaching his kids slogans from Trump's campaign and reading children's books to them about Donald Trump and talking about, I mean, just like every aspect of his life was completely engulfed in this, is the idea that this ad was giving, in being a fan of Donald Trump and Trumpism. Other than God, you should not have that kind of loyalty to anybody. And frankly, the fact that there are people that are looking at that and saying, well, he wants to make himself exactly like Trump, I understand that argument. And that's why you do not hitch your wagon that closely to anybody, because another thing too, even if it's somebody that you really like, I wouldn't have hitched my wagon for example, to somebody like Calvin Coolidge if he were resurrected right now and we're in the presidency. And the reason I say that is because even the best presidents, even the best politicians make dumb mistakes. And they can do a complete 180 on a policy issue, and then you look stupid because you're being disloyal. And so Ron DeSantis and a couple of other Republicans that have tried so hard to basically make themselves out to be a miniature version of Trump, I don't think that's wise. Run on your own merits, not the merits of people in your party, and convince me that you deserve my vote. So that being said, we're going to go ahead and go through several of these. This is the ballot for Elmore County. As you can see right there, this is the ballot for Elmore County. This is the county that I'm from, so it's going to be the template. I'm going to go over some races that are in different precincts, that are in different areas. I'm going to try to cover some of those, but I'm working off the one in Elmore County just because it's where I happen to live. It's what my ballot's going to look like, and so that's kind of the template we're going to go to. Let's go to a couple of things. First of all, the governor's race, that's obviously a really big one. You've got Kay Ivey versus Walt Maddox, and I discussed this a little bit on the radio this morning, but I'll just kind of give you a recap of that. When it comes to Walt Maddox, he has, and I understood this right after I did my interview with him, he has no chance of getting my vote. And the reason that he doesn't, regardless of who he was running against, he believes that if somebody is raped, then abortion is perfectly okay in that circumstance, which is a logical fallacy of gargantuan proportion. The idea that I have the right to take the life of somebody because somebody else, a unconnected third party, committed a crime against me, makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. And so because he is not sufficiently pro-life, now granted, he's more pro-life than most Democrats, I will say that. He did say that if there were legislation that came up to eliminate abortion on demand, to eliminate the 98% of rapes that have nothing to do with life of the mother, rape, or incest, that he would support that legislation. And so from Walt Maddox's standpoint, I do want to give him credit on that he is far more pro-life than most Democrats, but again, that's setting the bar incredibly low. And from my perspective, if you can't be on board with being pro-life all the way through, then there's really no chance that you have of getting my vote. And so when it comes to that, Walt Maddox was already dead in the water when he answered that question in the way that he did. But let's say that you're not necessarily, that's not as big of a sticking point with you as others. I do want to give you a little bit of insight on Walt Maddox's campaign. First of all, he's in favor of a increase in Medicaid for the state. He's going to essentially commit Alabama to spending millions of dollars a year. And the federal government is going to match some of that money to begin with, but after 3 years, that money goes away. And the issue that I ran into with him and to other Democrats, and none of them have a very good answer for this, is what happens when that money dries up? What happens when that money is no longer there? Because what you're telling me is that you are committing us to pay this massive bill, this massive expansion when it comes to Medicaid, and not giving me a plan 3 years down the road to be able to pay for it. Now, if you have a plan to pay for it, I'll listen. I'm probably not going to be in favor of it because I, on a principle level, disagree with the idea of government providing health care to anybody. But nonetheless, at least if you have a plan to pay for it, that becomes a little bit more feasible. But right now, Walt Maddox, he's already earmarked the money that he's saying is going to come in for gambling, for other things, and even if he hadn't, that money falls far short of what we're going to have to pay for that Medicaid expansion. And so right now, what he's essentially suggesting is that we commit ourselves to this massive spending bill that we have absolutely no way to pay off. And there is no plan to pay off in the future. And so because of that, I like Walt. He's a good guy. I think that he's, always been really cordial to me. But when it comes to that, he doesn't know what he's doing. And he doesn't have a plan other than we'll come up with something when that time comes. And that's not a plan. If, for example, you and your family were to go out and buy a new car, you don't just buy a car because you want to buy a car. You come up with a plan to pay for the car, then you consider buying the car, but you don't buy it first and say, we'll figure out a way to pay for it later. And that's, in essence, what Walt Maddox is planning to do. Now, he brought up some very legitimate points when it came to medical care in this state, where you're talking about the infant mortality rate, which is still way below the vast majority of the world, but if you're going state by state, it's not great in the state of Alabama. But another thing, too, one of the things that he's talking about is flooding the market with Medicaid expenditures. And anytime you flood any market like that with all this money that is specifically earmarked to it, prices necessarily go up. And Alabama having some of the lowest health care cost in the country, if you were to flood the market with that much money overnight, your prices would necessarily increase. We see the same thing with college tuition. When we started flooding the market with all these available student loans and grants, we saw the price of tuition skyrocket. If you're going back 30 years, it has gone up 4 times what it should have if you adjust for inflation. And so if we see this same kind of wild spending being dedicated to healthcare, what you're going to do is you're going to see the cost of healthcare necessarily go up. And even though he seemed sympathetic to that argument, he didn't really have a good answer for how we're going to prevent that. So that being said, Walt Maddox is pretty much dead in the water. Now let's look at Kay Ivey. Kay Ivey is very much a mixed bag. There are some things that I think that she has done as governor, which is great. She has kept her word about not adding on taxes, at least not yet. She's not really a budget hawk. She kind of portrays herself that way, but doesn't seem to be against spending. She doesn't seem to me to be very committed to it. She also did, even though she hasn't increased state income tax, she has been a supporter of and signed into law the internet retail tax, which is another tax by any other name. It's still a tax on Alabama citizens. And so she did increase taxes on that. She also was a big supporter of, and really the driving force, unfortunately, behind the law in the state of Alabama that if you are a economic developer, then you don't have to register as a lobbyist, which if you say we shouldn't be regulating lobbyists in the first place and take kind of a libertarian stance on it, I understand that argument to a degree. But if your argument is, well, let's have rules for lobbyists, but then have a carve out to where basically nobody has to adhere to them, then you're just making pointless laws at that point, and that makes the system ripe for corruption. It makes you appear as though you're doing something important to keep corruption out when really you're not. And the fact that Kay Ivey was one of the big drivers behind that, to me, was a big problem with her. Nonetheless, she has a phenomenal record when it comes to being pro-life. She's really good when it comes to agricultural issues. She understands that, and especially in the state of Alabama, where so much of our economy depends on agriculture, that is something that is really valuable to somebody that's in the governor's seat. Also, I don't buy these arguments that she's just too old or too senile or her health is too bad. Look, that's why we have a lieutenant governor's seat. Don't vote based on that. Vote based on whether or not you think Kay Ivey can do the job. And if you're looking at her job numbers, if you're looking at the economy, Alabama is at its lowest unemployment rate, I want to say in 30 years, maybe 35, and record low unemployment in the state of Alabama. So whether or not you like Kay Ivey, you look at the state economically, and some of that has to do with what's going on nationally, but Alabama's economy is pretty darn good right now. And Kay Ivey she does bear some of the responsibility for that and did a good job with cleaning up Governor Bentley and his mess after he left with getting out all of the corruption. So, again, Kay Ivy's very much a mixed bag for me, but I think that I can get on board with voting for her. So that will be where I'm going in the governor's race. So let's go ahead and look down ballot. The next thing that you have, and this is going to be very different based on what district you just happen to be in at the time. You'll notice right under the governor's race, we have the race for lieutenant governor. Now, this one's a statewide. I apologize. That was a statewide race. I was actually thinking that the House was coming up next. That's directly after that. So next up is lieutenant governor. William Boyd, guy's a lifelong Democrat, has a lot of Democrat principles when it comes to issues like abortion, when it comes to issues like economics. Again, he's always been real nice to me, real cordial, but we're not voting on personality. We're voting on policy, and we're voting on who is going to be a better fit for the state of Alabama. Lieutenant governor is one of those really strange positions. And the reason I say that, it's one of those strange positions that it's just not very important most of the time. And it's ridiculously important in a handful of rare circumstances. So, for example, if our Senate is tied, your lieutenant governor is the one that breaks that tie. And if, God forbid, something happens to the governor, which in the state of Alabama is not exactly unprecedented, then your lieutenant governor becomes your governor. That's how Kay Ivey got into the governorship in the first place. And so lieutenant governor is an important race. It's one of those strange races, though, because the position is almost entirely ceremonial, except for a handful of rare circumstances where it becomes incredibly important who happens to be the lieutenant governor. And Will Ainsworth is one of the most conservative representatives we have in the House or the Senate. Like, if you're looking at our congressman, he's one of the most conservative out there if you're going by his voting record. And because of that, really, Will Ainsworth is the shoe-in. I think that there's absolutely no question Will Ainsworth is far more qualified, both in experience and his record of conservatism, than William Boyd. So that one, really, I don't even have to think about all that much. Will Ainsworth is definitely the guy that I will be voting for this one. Now, the next one that you will see, and if you're looking at your ballot, you'll notice that it says there that there's going to be a decision between Tabitha Eisner and Martha Roby, and that is true for Elmore County. If you live in the surrounding area, if you're in Mike Rogers' district, that one is going to be real easy because he's running uncontested. So if you're in Montgomery and your representative happens to be Mike Rogers, then it's not really a decision for you. You can either write somebody in or you vote for Mike Rogers. So I won't spend any time on that one, really. So Martha Roby, Tabitha Eisner. Here's the deal. I have had an interview with Tabitha Eisner. I have not had an interview with Martha Roby. And the reason that I haven't is because despite all the times I've reached out to her, Martha Roby does not want to get on the radio with me. And there's a good reason for that. Because she knows that I'm going to call her out and ask her about her voting record, which is awful. I mean, just absolutely terrible. She is the most liberal Republican member, I should say. She is the most liberal Republican member of the Alabama delegation. I think her Liberty score last time I checked was like 56 if you're going by conservative review. If you look at the Heritage Foundation, if you're looking at Freedom Works, pretty much the same. And so, by any measure, if you're looking for someone who is a constitutionalist, who is a conservative, who believes in small government, you ain't looking at Martha Roby. Just as simple as that. Tabitha Eisner is just as liberal, if not more so. And when I did my interview with her, everything from the issue of life to economic issues, you could tell that she, didn't really know what she was talking about on most of them. Some of them she was actually fairly well educated and impressed me on her knowledge, even if I didn't agree with her conclusions. But most of the issues, you could tell she had only studied one side of each issue. And when you're looking at that, Tabitha Eisner she doesn't match the smell test, but neither does Martha Roby. And so on this one, I probably wind up writing in Becky Garrettson. You might remember Becky Garrettson. She is the president of the Wetumpka Tea Party. Had her on. She's filled in and hosted for me when I was out before, when I had cancer. And she's just phenomenal. She's probably the person that I'm going to vote for. She actually tried to get that same seat 2 years ago, and I voted for her and wrote her in that election too. I cannot cast my vote for Martha Roby. I mean, she's just awful on virtually every issue. She's a big government person. She is the epitome of a swamp person. When Paul Ryan asked her to jump, she asked how high. And she was the same way with John Boehner. And so I cannot in good conscience cast my vote for Martha Roby. So I will be doing a write-in for that one. So let's go ahead and look a little bit further down the ballot and see what we've got next. So after that, you have the Attorney General's race. This one, again, is one that's very easy for me. Steve Marshall was not my first pick. Steve Marshall was my second place guy when I was running. The guy did used to be a Democrat, and I want to address that real quickly. He was what I would consider a blue dog Democrat or a Dixiecrat back in the day. But the thing is, on issues of law enforcement, as long as you're going to enforce the law and not just open it up to your own private interpretation, I really don't care what your personal politics are. I don't. I mean, if you look at the law and say, it's my job to enforce this law, whether I agree with the law or not, I really don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat, as long as you can do that job. I've said the same thing when it comes to, for example, Supreme Court justices. If they can look at the law and take their own feelings and their own politics out of it, I don't care if you're a screaming liberal that believes in a massive welfare state. If you can look at the law and separate what you want from what the law actually says, then I don't really care what your personal beliefs are if you're in a law enforcement, because these guys aren't lawmakers, they're just enforcing the law. And so as long as you can do that, I don't really care what your personal politics are. In Steve Marshall's case, I don't think that he's uber liberal anyway, but I'm just saying that to make a point that the fact that he used to be a Democrat, as long as he's doing a good job, doesn't really matter all that much to me. I personally would have rather had Alice Martin, but just looking at the job that Steve Marshall has done since he was appointed, and whether or not you hold anything against him because he was appointed by Bentley, which I get is the kiss of death in the state of Alabama. Look, the guy recused himself immediately from that investigation, handled it exactly the right way, and I think that the guy has just done a remarkable job from the Attorney General's office. And I actually know a little bit more about this one than I do even most of the other races, because I have friends and people that work directly with Attorney General Marshall. And from every report that I've heard and people that I love and respect, they've said that he's done a really tremendous job there as Attorney General. And they were people that were skeptical of him in most cases when he originally came in, but were very pleased to see the job that he did. So with me, it's not even a question. Steve Marshall's doing a great job. Joe Siegelman has given me no indication whatsoever that he would be able to do a good job replacing Marshall. And so I think this one's fairly easy. I go with Steve Marshall on this one. So let's go ahead and look a little bit further down ballot. And we may need to pick up the pace here just a second because, actually, I say that. The next one is going to be the Chief Justice, and you have a choice between Bob Vance Jr. and Tom Parker. So, Bob Vance Jr. he's just, when it comes to his judicial review, the guy tends to, when it becomes a conflict between what the law actually says and what he wants the law to say, he tends to be a little bit of a judicial activist when it comes to this. He tends to rule with what he thinks the law should be as opposed to what he believes it actually is. And that's not good when it comes to a judge. Tom Parker, on the other hand, that guy is as committed an originalist as I've ever seen. I mean, he believes in the rule of law. He believes the law says what it says, and we should look at the original intent behind the law. If the law is vague, we should look at the raw wording of the law where it is not. And if you're looking for someone who is a constitutionalist who will faithfully execute the law, you could not ask for a better Supreme Court Chief Justice for Alabama Supreme Court than Judge Parker. Every time I've spoken to him, I've been incredibly, thoroughly impressed with him. And there's just no question in my mind that Tom Parker should be the guy there. He brags about this all the time, and I think honestly, when you are in this position, this is kind of a badge of honor that maybe you should brag about a little bit. He brags that George Soros tried to bring him down because of his pro-life stances. I do think that that's a badge of honor. I do think that's something to be respected because as radically pro-abortion on demand as George Soros is, and we're actually going to talk about Soros in just a minute, uh, that is a badge of honor. That is something to hold your head high on. And some of his the thing about Judge Parker is the only level higher than the Alabama Supreme Court is the American Supreme Court, the federal Supreme Court. And so you have to have somebody that's a Chief Justice that is going to have tightly worded, bold opinions so that it will be much harder for the Supreme Court to decide cases on narrow ground so we can get a clear idea of what their stance on a constitutional issue is. And when you're talking about a Supreme Court that now, for the first time in decades, may be sympathetic to the argument that the life of children in the womb ought to be protected on a federal level, we're going to need a Supreme Court justice that holds that view and that wants that outcome. And if you're looking at it, there's no competition. Tom Parker is the guy with the pro-life record to bring that forward. So there's absolutely no question in my mind. Judge Parker is the one that I want in that particular race. So let's look at this next one. What's the next race we have here? Secretary of State. Now, this one is actually pretty funny when you're looking at the Secretary of State race. John Merrill versus Heather Millam. And I've looked a little bit into Heather Millam and what she has to say, what she has to think, but to show you how ridiculously one-sided this race is, the Anniston Star, which has for a very long time been noted as a liberal-leaning newspaper, the Anniston Star, which is actually nicknamed amongst Alabama conservatives as the Red Star because of how liberal it typically is, it endorsed John Merrill. He is the only Republican that particular newspaper endorsed in any of the statewide elections. John Merrill has done such a good job when it comes to running elections and the other duties of the Secretary of State that even the Democrats are pulling for him. And you look at voter turnout, you look at the availability when people were decrying Alabama as being racist and engaging in voter suppression. John Merrill was the guy who went on both to the state, local media, and to national media, and he made a rock-solid case for why his department has, frankly, gone to ridiculous levels to try to make sure every individual that wants to vote is able to vote, and every individual that is not allowed to vote should not be able to get in or not be able to vote more than once. And his department has done a great job on this. We had record voter turnout. And once you looked at the case that he made, you really didn't have any room to go. You didn't have anywhere to go with that argument that voter suppression was being practiced in the state of Alabama. His department has done a great job of making sure that every single person that wants to be able to vote is able to vote, that all the roadblocks and the obstacles to that have been easily surmountable. And so virtually anybody, as long as you're in the state of Alabama and you want to vote, you can if you want to. And John Merrill should be commended for not only doing his regular job, which is just getting results when it comes to that, but furthermore, he has gone above and beyond on the call of duty, making the case to other people on the national stage and here in the state of Alabama that that's exactly what his department has been doing, and they've done a really good job of that. So he is not only a great leader for the State Department, he is also a great spokesman for the State Department, which are two qualities that, in my mind, make him a shoe-in for victory. So there's a few others that are uncontested. For example, for the state treasurer, that's John McMillan. I mean, he was a really good, I wouldn't say perfect, but certainly a good commissioner of agriculture. I think he'll be good at that job. I've supported him. You've got, speaking of commissioner of agriculture, you also have the commissioner of agriculture, Rick Pate, also running unopposed. I think that one's going to be fairly simple. And we've got to look at the race for state auditor. Jim Ziegler. Now, Jim Ziegler has been in the public eye in the state of Alabama since before I was even born. And I've never even heard so much as a rumor of the guy being corrupt. He is a very honest man, somebody that is strong in his faith, and the guy is just morally phenomenal. And because of that, and because of the way that it's just the way that he is. It's the kind of person that he is. There is nobody better suited, in my opinion, to be in charge of making sure everybody else's ducks are in a row and they're not shoveling money over to help their buddies. And I think that it's sad to me that he's announced that this is going to be the last time that he runs, but Jim Ziegler is absolutely the right man for the job. There has been not a convincing case from his Democrat opponent for why I would choose anybody else for that position. And so Jim Ziegler doing a great job there at our state auditor. And so because of that, I think that there's no question that he ought to be there. Now you'll notice that there are an awful lot of other races there on the ballot, but those are all mostly uncontested. I don't see any others here that are worthy of note that are being contested. So I guess well, there is one, even though this one, I'm actually in Clyde Chambliss's district, and he is also running uncontested. But I do want to mention that Will Barfoot, if I were in his district, which I'm not, that would be the person that I wound up voting for. So Will Barfoot, the guy's a conservative. He's really good. When it comes to the House, there's another contested race with Will Dismukes versus Corey Creel. I've met Corey once, and I don't know. When it comes to that, he's just not a fiscal conservative. He doesn't believe, in my opinion, in the free market enough. I think that Will Dismukes does. He gets a little iffy when we're talking about economic development. He likes economic development a little too much for my taste, but overall, Will Dismukes, very intelligent young man, a personal friend of mine, full disclosure, and somebody that is going to be honest. He's going to tell you everything up front. He's been very transparent, and I think that when it comes to economics, he believes in free market capitalism. He believes in the magic of people just making their own decisions. He believes in liberty, and he is really good, in my opinion, when it comes to education. That's kind of his pet issue, and I really appreciate that out of him. So Will Dismukes, definitely going to be my choice on that one. So let's look at a couple other things, and there's some probate judge, some local races, but the one that I want to focus on now is, you'll notice over there to your right, there are 4 amendments that I want to go over real quickly. And this is where I get a little bit iffy on some of the issues. First of all, Amendment 1, what it essentially states is that any school or government building that is owned by the state, it's state property, can display a monument of the 10 Commandments if they so desire. Now, y'all know I'm a minister. I got no problem with the 10 Commandments. I got no problem with Bible monuments being on government property. It's all over the place in D.C. If you've ever been to D.C., visited any of the monuments, there are Bible verses, for example, in Jefferson's memorial. You can see allusions to Moses and other religious leaders in, for example, our Supreme Court building. And so that idea has never bothered me. I've always been somebody that supported that. The reason that I'm kind of wavering on this one is because I see it as a largely useless law, because it's asserting that something is legal when it's already legal. And so I see it as being kind of redundant or not being all that useful. And the reason that I say that is it's already legal to do all the things that it's talking about. Now, I talked to a good friend of mine who's an attorney, Matt Clark, who feels a little bit differently than I do on this one. He says that because of some of the precedent, it adds a little bit of cover for people that want to do this. I don't know. It seems redundant to me. Now, there was one guy who got on and discussed this with me earlier this week, and he said that what this is really doing is it's a sort of a secret plan to try to build up and to try to get the separation of church and state done away with and bring it to a higher court. There's a couple reasons why that's not going to work. First of all, you're dealing with a state law as opposed to a federal law, and so the Constitution wouldn't apply there. But second of all, And this is the bigger reason why this is a completely untrue reason to oppose this amendment. Again, I might not even vote for it, but I wouldn't vote against it because of this reason. There's actually a provision in this amendment that specifically states that taxpayer money will not be used to defend this amendment. So if they were trying to get some kind of precedent overruled in the Supreme Court, they did it in the stupidest possible way because they can't even use taxpayer dollars from the state of Alabama to defend that amendment. So the idea that this is some kind of Trojan horse that they're going to try to do to get some kind of precedent overturned at the Supreme Court, there's no way for them to do that because they've taken out the provision that would allow them to defend it in a lawsuit. So that's just a stupid argument. The second one, this is one that I am absolutely voting yes on. It has to do with abortion. So here's the thinking behind this particular amendment. When it comes to Amendment 2, the reason that they decided to put this one forward is because Tennessee found itself in a really bad position to where their Supreme Court was striking down provision after provision that would limit access to abortions. For example, the 25-week rule that Tennessee tried to implement. And so there were 2 or 3, I think, anti-abortion legislation that was passed by the House, passed by the Senate, signed by their governor, passed by their, I think in their state, it's also just like it is here in the state of Alabama. You actually have to pass through constitutional amendments through the public. And so I think there was even a vote of the people that also voted for this, and it was overturned by the Supreme Court over and over again because it asserted that there was a right to an abortion under Tennessee's Constitution. So Tennessee, a very red state, wound up being an abortion haven. There would be people from other states that would be disqualified from abortions, even in very liberal states, that came to Tennessee to get an abortion just because of how lax the abortion laws had become because of that situation. So even though, especially with our current Supreme Court, I see no danger of that right now, really, that situation could theoretically in the future repeat itself in the state of Alabama. So all this amendment does is it asserts that under the state constitution in Alabama, you are not guaranteed a right to abortion. That is not a right that is recognized by the state constitution. And because of that, that sort of heads it off at the pass to make sure we don't wind up in a similar situation that Tennessee was in. It will not make abortion illegal in the state of Alabama. That's not its intent, and that would not be its effect if it were passed. So that's really the only thing that it does. Now, some people are saying that this one could be used as a lawsuit case that could overturn Roe v. Wade. That's possible. Doesn't really bother me. I want Roe v. Wade overturned. I don't think that that's actually the intention, though. Now, there is a myth that you could use this particular bill to prosecute, for example, a woman who smokes while she's pregnant because we know that that would endanger her baby. And that's one of the things that people have been using to try to get conservatives and Christians to vote against this. They're saying that because of the wording of this law, you could arrest a woman and have her tried for child endangerment because of the way that this law is worded. Here's the reason that's a myth. Because you can already do that. This is something that has taken place in this has been the law in Alabama for a long time. If you endanger your child in the womb, you can be tried for child endangerment. That is already the law. This amendment will do absolutely nothing to change that. Now, you may agree or disagree with that policy, but the point is, whether or not you vote for or against this measure will have absolutely no effect on the fact that child endangerment can already be prosecuted for somebody that has yet to be born. You can already bring that lawsuit forward. In fact, we had a couple of people that are sort of experts in this. They're both attorneys and they're working on some pro-life legislation right now, legislation. They're working on a pro-life lawsuit right now. You may remember it's my old co-host, Laura Glidewell, and also Sam McClure, both of which came up here, both of which talked about this. Child endangerment was one of the things that they addressed, and they said that specifically this would have absolutely no effect on current child endangerment laws. So if that's the thing that you're worried about, you really need to stop worrying. I'm not saying on this particular amendment, I think that there's no question you should vote in favor of this one if you care at all about the life of the unborn. The third one, I'm just going to go ahead and say it. I don't really care. It has to do with the board of directors for Alabama. I'm probably just going to abstain from this one because I don't have a dog in this fight. Or at least I don't feel like I have a dog in this fight. And so because of that, it doesn't break my leg or pick my pocket. So I don't really care about Amendment 3. It doesn't really bother me whether it passes or not. For those of you who are Alabama graduates, y'all can worry about that one. Let's see, Amendment 4, the special election rule. I think the intent behind this law is good, but it's always important for us to think about the difference between the intention of a law and what the law actually does and the effect that it actually has. And so because of that, I think that when you're talking about the special election, so what it would do, just to explain it, is if a seat becomes vacant after October 1st, and so that would mean that there's going to be less than a year between the special election and that person holding office and that person actually finishing out the term. So for whatever reason, whether it's a death or somebody gets thrown out of office or they resign, whatever it may be, that vacancy now cannot be filled by special election. You have to have an appointment of some kind or let it remain vacant. And I understand the logic behind this. They're trying to save money. They're trying to save money on special elections and keep that from being a big thing. Really, in this particular situation, I think what you ought to do is I can see somebody being justified voting either way for this one. I'm going to vote no on it just because I wish that the time span were a little bit less. For example, I get that you don't want somebody campaigning and getting into office and then a month later they have to run for office again to keep the seat that they just won. And that does seem like a waste of time and money. But what I'm talking about here is I think that it would be better if they scaled back the time slot just a little bit. So maybe make it January or February 1st, or make it 8 months before the election. To me, a year just seems like a little bit too much to say, no, absolutely, you cannot have a special election at this point. Maybe it's a really important office. Maybe there's a situation to where you really need somebody in that position. And so I would be okay with it if the time span were scaled back a little bit. To me, the time span is just a little too much. A year is just a little too much. And so for that reason, I'll probably vote no on it and hope that there's going to be similar legislation, maybe with an 8-month time span instead of a whole year. But again, I kind of could go either way on this one. So the final measure on here is it's going to be about home rule, and we'll talk about that in just a second, and we'll get to the daily dose of stupid. We're going to wrap this up here in just a little bit. Give me about 60 seconds. I'll be back.
Are on fire from trying to slow down. I'm always burning my tires and my horn is too loud. I catch people staring, looking funny at me when I step to the window and I toss a TV. Sometimes I get crazy and it makes a big scene, but when I hit 21, I wanna stand up and scream. I'm filthy rich with laughter, I'm too big for the room. You know, from 2 stories up, a zenith makes a big boom.
All right, welcome back. Now, this whole deal about home rule, this is in Elmore County. I don't like the idea of home rule because essentially, even though I understand the intent behind it, they're trying to keep people, for example, in neighborhoods from being able to let their weeds grow 3 feet tall and house snakes and all of that. It's a decent intent, but again, and I said this in the last segment, we have to be able to separate the actual effects from the intention of the law. And when we're coming to intent, I think it's really important we're able to separate those two things because usually what the law intended is not necessarily what happened. So the thing about home rule is that you can essentially, if you wanted to, and I understand that this has happened to some people, that even if you own 100 acres of land, for example, and there is a patch of it somewhere out in the woods where you've let the brush grow up, then you can be, by your county commission, held accountable for that and told that you have to take care of it. Which, if you're talking about a landowner that owns a lot of land like that, that's ridiculous. And so, especially being the libertarian-minded person that I am, the idea that anybody from the government can just tell you how to maintain your own land is ridiculous to me. If you're in a neighborhood where that becomes a problem and it starts lowering property values, I understand that, but that is a job for a homeowners association, not the law, not the government. And so I am 100% in favor of repealing home rule. I don't think that the intention matches what actually happened with it. And even if it did, that just grants the county commission too much power, in my opinion. And that's my primary gripe with it. So that being said, we're going to go ahead and go to our daily dose of stupid. Okay, not sure why that's messing up on me here. All right, sorry about that. My computer froze up. I'm not sure exactly why it's doing that, but nonetheless, we will soldier on, as it were. So here's the deal. When it comes to the daily dose of stupid, the other night, the Samantha Bee was going on a rant, and this is one thing that really bothers me about the way the Democrats are handling this election, because right before election day happened, they were basically making their final strides, what they were trying to do to convince people to get out and vote for them. Samantha Bee is no exception to this, and she was going out and saying this thing, which frankly just makes absolutely no sense to me. It makes absolutely no sense to me. Some of the accusations that she lobs in this. So we're going to go ahead and go to this clip by Samantha Bee.
Trump and many other Republicans reacted to the shooting by condemning anti-Semitism. Always nice when we can agree that some hate crimes are bad. But the truth is, the Republican Party tolerates anti-Semitism and benefits from it. Mainstream conservatives would never say anything negative about Jewish people outright, but there are other words they use, like coastal elites, globalists, Hollywood liberals, or John Leibowitz. And currently, the biggest, loudest dog whistle is George Soros.
Democrats, George Soros.
George Soros.
George Soros.
George Soros.
George Soros.
George Soros.
Soros. Soros. Soros.
Soros. Soros.
George Soros.
Genuinely radical billionaire George Soros.
George Soros is genuinely radical? That just makes him sound cool as hell. Hang 10, Joso. George Soros is a billionaire investor and Jewish Holocaust survivor who created a charitable foundation called Open Society. But according to right-wing conspiracy theories, George Soros is a demonic Nazi commie supervillain who controls every.
So I actually had Chris, who you may remember, he's been on the show before, a friend of mine. He asked me via Twitter, who is Samantha Bee and why do I care what she has to say? Well, you really shouldn't, but there are a lot of people that do. And she has a comedy show, and I put comedy in air fingers quotes because I've never found it all that funny. But she has a comedy show on some TV network on basic cable. I don't even remember what network. But anyway, she's on there, and she's somebody that the left sees as very witty and funny and entertaining. I don't really understand why, but the point is, she's out there saying this, and this is really indicative of a larger pitch. And Samantha Bee's not the one that started this. She's just kind of furthering the idea, because you've seen this on all the networks. They're pushing this idea that Trump is an anti-Semite. This has been their last big stretch before the election, which is a really dumb political move. I don't understand why this is the case. So there's a couple reasons why this is really stupid, because they're not only applying this to Trump himself, but you heard Samantha Bee saying this. She is expanding this to Republicans in general. First of all, the accusation makes no sense on Trump specifically, because he is the only president since the 60s, when Israel took over that part of the world, that has acknowledged that Israel's capital is in Jerusalem. He moved the embassy to Jerusalem, which is where it belongs. And so his policy has been very pro-Israel, very pro-Jewish. And if you're looking at him from a personal perspective, his son-in-law is Jared Kushner, who is Jewish. He's married to his daughter. And it would be one thing, because I know that as a dad, you don't necessarily have a ton of control over who your daughters fall in love with and marry. So I would understand that being not something that makes him completely immune to the accusation of anti-Semitism, if it were not for this. Not only is he his son-in-law, he's very close to Trump. He employed Jared Kushner for a number of years in his company, and he is now one of his White House advisors. So the idea that Trump is secretly this raging anti-Semite doesn't really make a whole lot of sense when you consider he's got a Jewish guy in his family who he appointed to be one of his advisors. And there are members of his family that are his own children, blood relatives, that do not have that position inside the White House. This is obviously somebody that Trump trusts. He likes him. So the idea that Trump is an anti-Semite, there's just no proof. In fact, there's evidence to suggest the opposite that I just presented. And so it's just a wild claim that it is the obvious last-ditch effort of a drowning man. You notice how when a drowning man realizes that he's drowning, he'll just start grasping for straws and grasping for anything that he can, and it doesn't matter what it is, he's just trying to grab onto it so he can stay afloat. That's what's going on with the Democrats right now. They are so desperate to win this election that they're throwing out anything that they think might get people to vote for them. Which, again, it's sad that this is a Trump-centric political universe, that people will mostly base their votes today, even though Trump is not on the ballot. They will mostly base it on whether or not they like Trump or don't like Trump, and that is sad. But nonetheless, Samantha Bee suggesting that he is some kind of closet anti-Semite is stupid. And here's another thing, too. The phrases that she says that are really secret dog whistles by Republicans and by conservatives to talk about their anti-Semitism. Coastal elites and Hollywood liberals and globalists. Okay, most coastal elites are not Jewish. Most Hollywood liberals also not Jewish. And furthermore, when you're looking at globalists, I have actually heard some alt-right people use that, and what they really do mean are Jews, but what they'll say is globalists and Jews. And that brings me to my final point when it comes to Samantha Bee. Where is this idea coming from that anti-Semites are all of a sudden shy and bashful and don't talk about how much they hate Jews? Have you read any history about anti-Semitism? They're always open and blatant and tell you that they don't like Jews. They are very unashamed of that. They come out and they tell you. If you're dealing with people that are neo-Nazis, alt-right, they will very quickly tell you that they don't like Jews. And so this idea that anti-Semites are just kind of secretly hiding in the wings and pretending that they're not anti-Semitic when they really are. Look, the people that are actually anti-Semitic and have done things to try to hurt the Jewish community, they're very vocal in their hatred of Jews. They ain't hiding it. They're not trying to hide the ball here. And you guys know, I've been very outspoken in my disdain for the alt-right. I hate their actions. I don't hate them. But I was one of the first people to denounce them when it came to Charleston. I was talking about them long before that. I was one of the earliest conservative show hosts that I'm aware of. I think probably Ben Shapiro and Glenn Beck beat me to the punch. But other than that, I've been talking about how evil the alt-right is for a long time. They've come after me. They've come after members of my family because they've adopted children that are not the same race as them. And I had people that were in the alt-right that came after them because of that. I do not like the alt-right and never have. There is no place anywhere in my heart for anti-Semitism. And so this idea, because you don't like Hollywood elites, you don't like people that make millions of dollars talk to you about how much capitalism sucks, that makes you an anti-Semite. That's stupid. Same thing for coastal elites. You don't like people in New York City and LA telling you in Nebraska or Alabama or Georgia or Idaho how to run your life. The idea that that makes you anti-Semitic, or that's really a dog whistle for how much you hate Jews, that's also stupid. And globalist, there are some aspects of economics where globalization is a good thing. There's many where there's not. I don't want one world government. I don't like the UN, and I don't like people in the UN thinking that they can tell the United States, a sovereign nation, how to run our business. So yes, in that sense, I don't like globalists. That doesn't make me anti-Semitic either. And the evidence, being real fast and loose with the word evidence here, that Samantha Bee is proving that they're really anti-Semitic because they don't like George Soros, well, that's just stupid. You can dislike somebody of a certain race and not hate the entire race. For example, I really don't like Barack Obama. Doesn't mean I don't like black people. My co-host is Kevin Elkins. Guess what? He's black. I've had roommates that were black. And if you're asking me about people that I like and people that I don't like Barack Obama. I don't like Loretta Lynch. I don't like Eric Holder. I do like Clarence Thomas. I do like Sheriff Clark. I do like Colonel Allen West. I do like Mia Love. And so if somebody likes some people of a race and dislikes other people of that same race, that would lead you to the conclusion that what? That they are judging people based on their individual ideas, which is the way that it's supposed to be. Like Dr. Martin Luther King said, judge them not on the color of their skin by the content of their character. And this is unfortunately a Democrat talking point that has been around for a really long time. There is this popular idea in the Democrat Party that if you dislike any person from their side that is of a particular race, the only possible explanation is because of racism. If you didn't vote for Hillary Clinton, it's because you're a sexist. If you didn't vote for Barack Obama, it's because you hate black people. Which is just blatantly stupid. There are women that I would have voted for. There are women that I did vote for. The candidate that I voted for, Ted Cruz, his running mate, was Carly Fiorina. And so, unfortunately, it really does show that they are not intellectually honest, and they are willing to say anything if they think that it will get people to vote for them. Because when you knowingly are telling people that this means that they're racist because they dislike one person of that race because of their political ideology, and let's be honest about this, George Soros has funded some of the worst people in the world. He's funded, you go back to Open Societies, the Tides Foundation, you look at some of the work that they've done to try to commit genocide on the unborn. You look at the way that he has donated to Democrats. Of course, Republicans don't like the guy. When you guys talk about how evil the Koch brothers are, which is ironic because the Koch brothers are actually pretty socially liberal, they just like fiscal conservatism, so they happen to vote Republican a lot of the time. When you talk about how evil the Koch brothers are, we don't assume it's because you hate white people. We assume it's because the Koch brothers stand for different things than you do and give money to causes that you don't like. And that's fine. And so this idea that just because you dislike George Soros, it means you must be secretly an anti-Semite. That's really beyond the pale, and there's absolutely no evidence for it. All right, so we're going to go ahead and jump to the chaplain's report here in just a second.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday, while other armies advanced on their
All right, Chaplain's report today. It would help if I turn my mic on. Chaplain's report today comes from the book of Romans 14:11 through 12. And I think that this is an appropriate scripture to read when you consider that it is election day. So Romans 14:11 through 12. For it is written, As I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall give praise to God. So then, every one of us will give an account of himself to God. So I'm going to sort of take the second point that passage gives first. We're going to have to give an account of every single thing that we do to God. And that includes our vote. And this has been my standard for a very long time. I say this every election day. If you are casting a vote that you would not want to have to explain to God why you voted that way on Judgment Day, then you should not be casting that vote, because guess what? You are going to have to explain your voting record to God one day. You're going to have to explain why you made the decisions that you did, because you're going to have to explain everything in your life. And if you're casting one that you do not want to have to justify to God on Judgment Day, that is a vote you do not need to be casting. So that is something that we as Christians, people who believe that God is going to hold us accountable for the actions that we take, we need to consider that when we're voting. We need to vote for people that God would approve of. Doesn't mean they have to be perfect. Doesn't mean that there can be no blemishes or no flaws in them whatsoever. But what it does mean is that we have to at least consider, okay, who would God want me to pick as our leaders? Because as people who do live in a free republic, we have a responsibility to take voting seriously, to educate ourselves on the issues, and to vote for people that share our values. Doesn't mean I want a theocracy. Doesn't mean that there should be some kind of religious test for that. But if we're casting a vote for somebody that it is very clear that God would not approve of, we need to seriously consider why it is okay for us to cast that vote, and whether or not we would be able to explain that to God when we are being judged. And now I want to go back to the first point that is made in verse 11. Every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall give praise to God. Now, what does that mean? That means regardless of your political affiliation, regardless of what you believed, whether you were an atheist or an agnostic or a Muslim or a Hindu or whatever else you were, that when God comes back, every knee is going to bow down, every tongue is going to confess that God is God. And when that happens, all of those things are not going to matter anymore. Not saying the decisions you made in life aren't going to matter, because obviously they are. It tells us that in the next verse. But what I'm saying is, eventually God wins. Whether you support God now, voluntarily, or you say that he is God when he comes back on Judgment Day, you are going to know that God is real. And whether or not you live in rebellion, or you live according to the will and according to the laws that he gave us, that is going to be what is hashed out on that day. But regardless of how you've lived, on that day you are going to bow, and you are going to confess that God is God and he is the creator. And so regardless of how this election turns out, because I know that there's probably going to be some races that we're really happy about the results, some races that we're not so happy about. At the end of the day, when it's all said and done, regardless of what policies go through or who winds up in office, eventually God wins, and his will is going to be done, whether we like it or not. Stay the course, friends.